The auctioneer's hammer fell with a thunderous crack that shattered the silence of Keeneland's prestigious horse auction, and with it, another dream was crushed beneath the weight of Mortimer Ashworth's limitless fortune. The bay stallion, worth more than most people's homes, had just become his latest acquisition, the 47th thoroughbred to join his private collection in the rolling hills of Kentucky. Mortimer adjusted his platinum cufflinks as whispers rippled through the crowd of wealthy bidders who had learned over the years to simply stop raising their paddles when he entered the fray. At 62, he had built an empire that stretched from Silicon Valley tech companies to Manhattan real estate, but horses had become his consuming passion, or rather, owning them had. "Congratulations, Mr. Ashworth," the auction house director approached with practiced deference. "Thunderbolt's legacy will make a fine addition to your stable." Mortimer nodded curtly, his steel-gray eyes already scanning the catalog for the next lot. He had attended every major horse auction in the country for the past 5 years, systematically acquiring champions, prospects, and bloodlines with the methodical precision that had made him a billionaire. His sprawling Windermere estate housed the most expensive collection of horseflesh in North America, each animal catalogued, trained, and maintained by a team of professionals who knew better than to question their employer's relentless pursuit. The auction continued, and true to form, Mortimer's bids prevailed lot after lot. The Arabian mare from Dubai, his. The racing champion's offspring, his. The prized breeding stock from Ireland, his. Other bidders had long since given up competing seriously, knowing that Ashworth Industries' resources were virtually bottomless. But then Lot 49 entered the ring. The horse was unremarkable at first glance, a small Mustang with a coat the color of desert sand and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Unlike the prancing thoroughbreds and spirited Arabians that had preceded her, this mare stood quietly, almost contemplatively, as if she understood something the room full of wealthy humans did not. "This is Serenity," the auctioneer announced, though his voice lacked the enthusiasm he'd shown for the previous lots. A 10-year-old Mustang mare, rescued from Bureau of Land Management holding facilities. She's been gentled and trained for basic riding, but her bloodlines are unknown. Mortimer almost dismissed her entirely. His collection focused on elite bloodstock, horses with pedigrees that read like nobility's family trees. But something about the mare's steady gaze held his attention. Perhaps it was the challenge. He had never encountered a horse he couldn't purchase. The bidding began at a modest $500. A few hands went up, small ranchers perhaps, or riding instructors, looking for a reliable mount. Mortimer raised his paddle with casual confidence, expecting the usual immediate retreat of his competitors. But a voice from the back called out a higher bid. Mortimer turned to see a weathered man in worn jeans and a simple flannel shirt, his calloused hands raising a numbered paddle with quiet determination. The man's eyes met his briefly, not with challenge or defiance, but with something deeper, something that spoke of understanding horses in a way that went beyond price tags and prestige. "Do I hear 800? The auctioneer called. Mortimer's paddle shot up. He had never lost a bidding war, and he wasn't about to start with some nameless Mustang and a farmer who clearly couldn't afford to compete with billions. But the man in flannel bid again and again. For the first time in 5 years of horse auctions, Mortimer found himself in a real fight. The price climbed past reasonable, past sensible, into the realm where pride and principle mattered more than prudence. The room grew quiet, sensing something unprecedented unfolding before their eyes. When the hammer finally fell at $15,000, 30 times the mare's opening bid, it wasn't Mortimer Ashworth's paddle that had claimed victory. The silence that followed the auctioneer's final call felt like a physical blow to Mortimer's chest. For several heartbeats, he remained, frozen in his seat, his paddle half raised in disbelief. The room around him seemed to hold its collective breath, as if witnessing the impossible, the first time in living memory that Mortimer Ashworth had lost a bid. The man in flannel, Josiah Clearwater, as Mortimer learned from overhearing conversations, made his way to the auction office with the unhurried gait of someone who had never doubted the outcome. There was no triumph in his step, no smugness in his weathered features. He simply collected his paperwork and arranged transport for serenity, as if purchasing horses at premium prices was something he did every Tuesday afternoon. Mortimer's personal assistant, Cordelia Vance, appeared at his elbow with practiced discretion. "Sir, shall I approach Mr. Clearwater about a purchase? Perhaps offer double what he paid?" "No," Mortimer said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made Cordelia take a step back. "Not yet." But even as he spoke, Mortimer's mind was already spinning with possibilities. Money had been his universal key for so long that he couldn't conceive of a lock it wouldn't eventually open. Clearwater might have won the auction, but auctions were just the beginning of negotiations, not the end. Over the following weeks, Mortimer's usual contentment with his vast collection felt hollow. He walked the immaculate paddocks of Windermere estate, past thoroughbreds worth millions of dollars, but his thoughts kept returning to the Mustang mare and the man who had outbid him. His stable manager, Preston Fairweather, noticed the change immediately. "The new acquisitions are settling in well, Mr. Ashworth," Preston reported during their weekly review. "Thunderbolt's legacy has exceptional conformation, and the Arabian mare is already showing promising speed in training." Mortimer nodded absently, barely listening. Through his connections in the horse industry, he had learned that Josiah Clearwater ran a small operation called Healing Hooves Ranch, about 40 miles south of Louisville. It wasn't a training facility or breeding operation in any traditional sense. It was something far more unusual that intrigued and puzzled Mortimer in equal measure. "Preston," Mortimer said suddenly, interrupting his stable manager's report about feed costs. "What do you know about therapeutic riding programs?" Preston blinked in surprise. "Therapeutic riding? Well, it's using horses to help people with disabilities or trauma, I believe. Not really our area of expertise, sir. We focus on racing, breeding, showing. Find out everything you can about Healing Hooves Ranch," Mortimer instructed. "I want a complete report by Friday." When the report arrived, it painted a picture that challenged everything Mortimer thought he understood about the horse business. Josiah Clearwater wasn't collecting horses. He was healing people with them. Veterans with PTSD, children with autism, adults recovering from trauma, elderly individuals fighting depression and isolation. The ranch operated on grants, donations, and what little tuition could be charged to those who could afford it. Most interesting of all was the waiting list. Despite the modest facilities and lack of expensive horses, people traveled from neighboring states to work with Clearwater's program. The testimonials were extraordinary. Lives changed, trauma healed, hope restored through connection with gentle horses who seemed to understand human pain in ways that traditional therapy couldn't touch. And at the center of it all was serenity, described in multiple accounts as having an almost supernatural ability to calm the most troubled individuals. Children who hadn't spoken in months would whisper to her. Veterans who couldn't sleep would find peace in her presence. Adults who had given up on life would discover purpose in caring for her. Mortimer read the report 3 times, each reading deepening his bewilderment. The ranch's annual operating budget was less than he spent on hay for his collection in a single month. Yet somehow, Clearwater was accomplishing something with horses that all of Mortimer's wealth and prestige couldn't buy. He found himself standing in his climate-controlled trophy room, surrounded by ribbons, cups, and photographs of his prize-winning horses, feeling emptier than he had since building his fortune. His horses were magnificent specimens, perfectly trained and impeccably maintained. They were also, he realized, with uncomfortable clarity, essentially expensive ornaments in his vast collection of possessions. When had he last felt genuine connection with any of them? When had he experienced the kind of transformation that seemed to happen daily at a small ranch, with worn fences and donated hay? The question haunted him through sleepless nights, until he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would visit Healing Hooves Ranch, not as a potential buyer or donor, but as someone seeking to understand what he had been missing in his relentless pursuit of ownership. He told himself it was business curiosity, but deep down, Mortimer suspected that the Mustang mare who had cost him his first auction defeat might have something to teach him that couldn't be purchased at any price. Mortimer's Bentley looked absurdly out of place as it wound down the gravel drive of Healing Hooves Ranch, past simple wood rail fencing that had been repaired more times than replaced. The contrast to his own estate couldn't have been starker, where Windermere boasted perfectly manicured paddocks and gleaming stable blocks. Clearwater's ranch embraced the honest wear of constant use and genuine purpose. He had called ahead, introducing himself simply as someone interested in learning about therapeutic writing. Josiah Clearwater had agreed to meet with him, though something in the older man's voice suggested he knew exactly who was coming to visit. Mr. Ashworth, Josiah greeted him at the modest main barn, extending a calloused hand without ceremony. Up close, Mortimer could see that the rancher was probably in his late 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. "Welcome to Healing Hooves. Thank you for seeing me," Mortimer replied, accepting the firm handshake. "I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure why I'm here." Josiah's smile held understanding rather than judgment. "Most folks who find their way here are carrying questions they can't quite put into words yet. Would you like to meet some of our team?" As they walked toward the writing arena, Mortimer was struck by the atmosphere of the place. Despite the modest facilities, there was an energy here that his pristine estate lacked, a sense of purpose and community that money couldn't manufacture. Volunteers were leading horses while individuals of various ages and abilities worked on basic exercises, each partnership unique in its challenges and progress. But it was the scene near the round pen that stopped Mortimer in his tracks. Serenity stood calmly in the center of the enclosure, while a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, sat cross-legged in the dirt nearby, not touching the mare but simply existing in her presence. The child's face bore the hollow expression Mortimer had learned to associate with profound trauma, but there was something in her posture, a subtle relaxation, that suggested the beginnings of peace. "That's Luna," Josiah said quietly. "She hasn't spoken since witnessing a car accident that took her parents 6 months ago. Her grandmother brings her here twice a week. Serenity seems to understand what she needs." As they watched, the mare took a single step closer to the girl, lowering her head slightly. Luna reached out with tentative fingers to touch the horse's muzzle, and for just a moment something flickered in her expression. Not quite a smile, but a crack in the wall of her grief. "How does it work?" Mortimer asked, his voice rougher than intended. "Horses are prey animals," Josiah explained. "They survive by reading energy, by sensing truth beneath surface emotions. They don't judge or demand explanations. They simply respond to what's real in a person. For someone carrying trauma or struggling with communication, that acceptance can be revolutionary." They continued their tour, and Mortimer found himself witnessing scene after scene that challenged his understanding of what horses could offer. Humans. A teenager with autism who had never made eye contact with another person was grooming a patient gelding, speaking to the animal in soft, clear sentences. A veteran with severe PTSD was leading a mare through obstacle courses, his hypervigilance transformed into focused attention that served both him and the horse. But it was in the therapy office attached to the barn that Mortimer encountered the most surprising revelation. The walls were covered with photographs, letters, and artwork, not of ribbon-winning performances or prestigious bloodlines, but of moments of connection, healing, and breakthrough. Children learning to trust again, adults discovering they could feel joy after trauma, families finding new ways to communicate through shared experience with horses. "These are your trophies," Mortimer said, understanding dawning. Josiah nodded. "Every horse person measures success differently. For some, it's speed or confirmation or winning. For us, it's the moment someone who has given up on themselves decides to try again." "And serenity?" Mortimer asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "She's our heart," Josiah said simply. "I've worked with therapeutic horses for 20 years, and I've never encountered one with her intuitive ability to meet people exactly where they are emotionally. She seems to know what each person needs: comfort, challenge, patience, or gentle encouragement. As they walked back toward the main barn, Mortimer found himself thinking about his own collection. 47 magnificent horses, each worth more than most people's annual salaries, living lives of pampered isolation. When had he last seen one of them touch someone's life the way Serenity had touched Luna's in just the few minutes he'd observed? "Mr. Clearwater," he said as they reached his car, "I need to ask you something directly. I know you recognized me at the auction. You knew you were bidding against someone who could have paid 10 times what you offered for that mare. Why was it so important that you win her?" Josiah was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the fence rail, as he gazed toward the pasture where several of the therapy horses grazed in companionable groups. "Because," he said finally, "some horses are meant to serve something bigger than individual ownership. Serenity isn't just a horse you can buy, she's a calling you have to earn. And honestly, Mr. Ashworth, I wasn't sure you were ready to understand that yet." The words hit Mortimer like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. As he drove away from Healing Hooves Ranch, past his own gates and up the pristine drive to his mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was returning to a beautiful, empty prison of his own making. 3 days after his visit to Healing Hooves Ranch, Mortimer found himself standing in his stable at dawn, watching his prize horses eat their precisely measured breakfast. The building hummed with efficiency: automatic waterers, climate control, and rubber flooring that cost more per square foot than most people's homes. Everything was perfect, sterile, and utterly devoid of the energy he had witnessed at Clearwater's modest operation. Preston approached with the day's schedule, but Mortimer waved him away. For the first time in years, he wanted to be alone with his horses, to see if he could find even a fraction of the connection he had observed between Serenity and the broken child named Luna. He approached Thunderbolt's Legacy, the stallion he had purchased for $1.2 million just weeks earlier. The horse was magnificent, 16 hands of perfectly proportioned muscle and grace, with bloodlines that read like a who's who of racing royalty. But as Mortimer extended his hand, the stallion barely acknowledged his presence, more interested in the grain in his feed bucket than the man who owned him. Moving from stall to stall, Mortimer encountered the same polite indifference. His horses were well-trained, healthy, and valuable, but they were also emotional strangers to him. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that he knew their purchase prices better than their personalities, their pedigrees better than their preferences. That afternoon, his phone rang. Cordelia's voice was carefully neutral as she announced, "Mr. Clearwater from Healing Hooves Ranch is on line 1, sir." Mortimer's pulse quickened unexpectedly. "Put him through." "Mr. Ashworth?" Josiah's voice carried its characteristic calm. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," Mortimer replied, moving to his office window that overlooked the stables. "What can I do for you?" "Well, it's more about what you might be able to do for yourself," Josiah said with what sounded like gentle amusement. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, and I have a proposition. Would you be interested in volunteering at the ranch for a few weeks? We could use help with basic care, mucking stalls, grooming, feeding. Nothing fancy, but it might give you a different perspective on horses." Mortimer's first instinct was to decline. Mortimer Ashworth didn't muck stalls, he employed people to muck stalls. But something in Josiah's tone suggested this was less about needing help and more about offering something Mortimer didn't know he needed. "What would be the point?" he asked. "The point," Josiah said, "would be to find out if you love horses or if you just love owning them. There's a difference, though not everyone realizes it until they're confronted with both possibilities." The words stung because they echoed thoughts Mortimer had been trying to avoid since his visit to the ranch. "And if I discover I only love owning them, then you'll know something important about yourself, and you can decide what to do with that knowledge. But if you discover you actually love the horses themselves," Josiah paused, "well, that opens up possibilities you might not have considered." That evening, Mortimer called his personal physician and arranged for a complete physical. He hadn't done manual labor in decades and wasn't sure his body would survive mucking stalls. He also quietly rearranged his schedule, delegating meetings, and pushing back deadlines in ways that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. 3 days later, he arrived at Healing Hooves Ranch dressed in jeans and boots he'd had to purchase specially for the occasion. Josiah greeted him with a wheelbarrow and a pitchfork, and Mortimer began the most humbling education of his adult life. The work was harder than he'd anticipated. His soft hands blistered within hours, his back ached from bending and lifting, and the smell of manure clung to his clothes in ways that his mansion staff would find alarming. But something unexpected happened as the days passed. He began to notice things about horses that all his years of collecting had never revealed. He learned that the old gelding named Chance had a habit of resting his chin on volunteers' shoulders when they cleaned his stall, seeking gentle human contact. He discovered that the mare called Wistba would only drink water if someone she trusted was nearby, a quirk that spoke to past trauma and present healing. He observed how Serenity seemed to sense the emotional state of every person who entered the barn, adjusting her energy to match what they needed. Calm for the anxious, steady for the grieving, playful for those ready to find joy again. But it was during his second week while grooming a rescued thoroughbred named Phoenix that Mortimer experienced his own moment of revelation. The horse had been found abandoned and malnourished, his racing career ended by injury, and his value in the traditional horse world reduced to nothing. Yet as Mortimer worked the brush through Phoenix's coat, feeling the animal relax under his touch, he realized he was experiencing something he had never felt with any of his expensive acquisitions: genuine, mutual affection. Phoenix turned his head to nuzzle Mortimer's shoulder, a gesture of trust and contentment that had nothing to do with bloodlines or purchase prices. In that moment, Mortimer understood what Josiah had been trying to show him: the difference between possessing something beautiful and participating in something meaningful. "He likes you," Josiah observed, appearing in the doorway of the grooming stall. "How can you tell?" Mortimer asked, though his heart already knew the answer. "Same way you can tell," Josiah replied with a smile. "He's telling you with his whole body that you're someone worth trusting. Phoenix doesn't care how much money you have or what horses you own. He cares that you're present with him, paying attention to what he needs, treating him like an individual rather than an object." That night, Mortimer lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, his blistered hands aching and his expensive sheet smelling faintly of horses despite 2 showers. For the first time in decades, he felt genuinely tired in a way that came from meaningful work, rather than stress and ambition. And for the first time in years, he fell asleep without wondering what acquisition would fill the hollow feeling in his chest. By his 4th week at Healing Hooves Ranch, Mortimer had developed calluses on his palms and could muck a stall in half the time it had initially taken him. More importantly, he had begun to understand the subtle language of horses in ways that no amount of money had ever taught him. The other volunteers, mostly local people who donated their time between regular jobs, had stopped treating him like an oddity and started including him in the easy camaraderie that developed around shared purpose. It was during this time that he witnessed Serenity's most profound demonstration of the mysterious connection between horses and human healing. A new client had arrived, Marcus Templeton, a firefighter whose crew had been lost in a warehouse collapse. The man's physical injuries had healed, but his emotional wounds remained raw and seemingly untouchable. 3 months of traditional therapy had barely scratched the surface of his survivor's guilt and paralyzing anxiety. Marcus sat on a bench outside the round pen, his hands shaking as he watched other clients work with their assigned horses. He had specifically requested not to work with any animal, insisting he was only there because his wife had begged him to try something, anything, to help with his nightmares and panic attacks. But Serenity had other plans. While Josiah worked with another client nearby, the Mustang mare calmly left her position and approached the fence where Marcus sat. She didn't demand attention or perform any trained behavior. She simply stood quietly within arm's reach, her presence as steady and undemanding as breathing. "She wants to meet you," Josiah said gently to Marcus, "but only if you're ready." "I'm not ready for anything," Marcus replied, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I can't even sleep without seeing their faces. I can't save my own crew. And you want me to work with a horse?" Serenity remained motionless, but something in her dark eyes seemed to acknowledge Marcus's pain without judgment. Minutes passed in silence, the only sounds the distant conversations of other therapy sessions, and the soft rustling of horses in nearby paddocks. Then, almost involuntarily, Marcus reached through the fence rails and touched Serenity's neck. The mare leaned into the contact, not dramatically, but with the subtle shift of an animal accepting trust. Marcus's breathing, which had been shallow and rapid since his arrival, began to slow and deepen. "She lost her herd in a wildfire," Josiah said quietly. "Rangers found her alone, the only survivor of a group that had been together for years. She understands what it means to carry the weight of being the one who lived." Mortimer watched from across the barn, as something fundamental shifted in Marcus's posture. The firefighter's shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, began to relax. His hands, which had trembled with anxiety, grew steady as they stroked Serenity's coat. "How does she know?" Marcus whispered. "Horses don't analyze or try to fix," Josiah explained. "They just recognize truth and respond to it. She's not trying to take away your pain or tell you it shouldn't exist. She's just showing you that pain can coexist with connection. That survival doesn't have to mean isolation." Over the following weeks, Mortimer observed Marcus's gradual transformation through his work with Serenity. The firefighter learned to groom her, to lead her through simple exercises, and eventually to ride. But more importantly, he learned to carry his grief without being crushed by it, to find purpose in helping other trauma survivors rather than being consumed by survivors' guilt. The change in Marcus was remarkable, but it was the change in Mortimer himself that proved most surprising. Watching Serenity work with broken humans had awakened something in him that decades of acquiring and owning had never touched. He began to understand that his massive collection of expensive horses was actually a symptom of emptiness rather than abundance. "Josiah," he said one evening as they finished the daily feeding, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." The ranch owner set down his grain bucket and gave Mortimer his full attention. "If I offered to donate money to expand your program, really expand it, help more people, would you accept?" Josiah considered the question carefully. "Depends on the conditions," he said finally. "What do you mean?" "Some donors want to help, and some donors want to control. Some want to support our mission, and some want to change it into something that makes them feel better about themselves. Which kind are you?" The question cut straight to the heart of Mortimer's motivations, forcing him to examine whether he was offering genuine support or seeking another form of ownership. He thought about his stable full of trophy horses, his business empire built on acquiring and controlling, his lifetime pattern of solving problems by purchasing solutions. "I honestly don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like to learn the difference." "Then we can work with that," Josiah smiled. "Because recognizing you don't know something is the first step toward actually learning it." That night, Mortimer walked through his own stables one more time, seeing them with eyes that had been changed by weeks of meaningful work. His horses were beautiful, valuable, and utterly disconnected from any purpose beyond his own ego. They lived lives of pampered emptiness, just as he had lived a life of wealthy isolation. But unlike his horses, he still had the opportunity to choose something different. As he stood in his trophy room, surrounded by ribbons and photographs celebrating acquisitions rather than relationships, Mortimer began to formulate a plan that would have seemed impossible just 2 months earlier. It was audacious, potentially expensive, and would require him to abandon everything he thought he knew about success and ownership. It was also the first plan he had made in decades that excited rather than burdened him. The letter arrived at Healing Hooves Ranch on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after Mortimer's first volunteer shift. Josiah opened the formal-looking envelope with curiosity, expecting perhaps a donation check or legal document. Instead, he found something unprecedented: a deed transferring ownership of 47 thoroughbred horses to the Healing Hooves Foundation, along with a substantial endowment for their care and a proposal that took his breath away. Mortimer had liquidated his entire collection, horses worth millions of dollars, and was offering them to therapeutic riding programs across the country. But the real surprise was his request to purchase a small cabin on the edge of Healing Hooves Ranch property, where he wanted to live and work full-time as a volunteer coordinator and program developer. He wants to give away his fortune to expand therapeutic riding programs, Josiah told his wife, Autumn, that evening as they sat on their porch watching Serenity graze in the pasture below. And he wants to donate his time instead of just his money. Autumn raised an eyebrow. The man who tried to buy our whole program 6 months ago wants to give away everything and volunteer? Apparently, Serenity taught him something we couldn't have explained in words, Josiah mused. When Mortimer arrived the next day to discuss his proposal, he looked different than the polished businessman who had first visited the ranch. His hands bore the permanent calluses of someone who worked with horses daily. His expensive clothes had been replaced by practical work gear, and his eyes held a peace that no amount of wealth had ever provided. I know it sounds dramatic, he said as he sat across from Josiah in the ranch office, but I've spent the last 6 months trying to figure out what genuine success looks like, and I keep coming back to what I see here. People's lives actually changing, trauma being healed, hope being restored. I want to be part of something that matters. What about your business empire? Josiah asked. Sold most of it, kept enough to ensure I'm not a financial burden, but the rest is going into therapeutic riding programs. I've identified 12 facilities across 7 states that could triple their capacity with proper funding and support. Mortimer's voice carried an enthusiasm that had been absent from all his discussions of business acquisitions. I want to help create a network where people like Marcus can find healing, where children like Luna can learn to trust again. And your horses? Phoenix is staying here if you'll have him. He's not fancy enough for racing or showing, but he has the temperament for therapy work. As for the others. Mortimer paused, his expression thoughtful. I'm interviewing therapeutic riding programs personally, making sure each horse goes somewhere they can actually help people rather than just exist as expensive ornaments. Over the following weeks, the transformation of Mortimer's horses from private collection to healing partners became a story that spread throughout the therapeutic riding community. Thunderbolt's legacy went to a program in Colorado that worked with veterans. The Arabian mare found a new home at a facility helping children with autism. Each placement was carefully considered, matching horses with programs that could utilize their specific temperaments and abilities. But it was Serenity's role in Mortimer's transformation that proved most profound. The mare had somehow sensed what he needed. Not another possession to add to his collection, but a lesson in the difference between owning and serving. Through his work with her and the other therapy horses, he had discovered that true wealth lay not in what he could acquire, but in what he could contribute. On a crisp morning in December, exactly 1 year after the auction where he had first encountered Serenity, Mortimer stood in the round pen working with a new client, a teenager named River who had been struggling with severe depression. The boy hadn't spoken during his first 3 sessions, but today something was different. She's really listening to me, River said quietly, his hand resting on Serenity's neck as the mare stood with characteristic patience. How can you tell? Mortimer asked, though he already knew the answer from his own experience. I can feel it, River replied. She's not trying to fix me or judge me, she's just here, really here. Mortimer nodded, understanding flooding through him as he watched the same miracle he had witnessed dozens of times over the past year. Serenity's gift wasn't something that could be bought or owned. It was something that could only be received through genuine presence and connection. That evening, as he sat in his small cabin reviewing applications from potential therapy riding programs, Mortimer reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had begun the year as one of the wealthiest men in America, surrounded by expensive possessions that provided no real satisfaction. He was ending it with a fraction of his former net worth, living in a one-bedroom cabin, and working jobs that had once been beneath his consideration. He had never been happier in his life. Through his window, he could see serenity in her paddock, moonlight silvering her desert sand coat as she grazed peacefully. The mare who had cost him his first auction defeat had ultimately given him something far more valuable than victory. She had shown him the difference between having everything and meaning something. His phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. It was Marcus, the firefighter, calling to share news that he had just graduated from a firefighter instructor program and would be helping train new recruits while also volunteering at a therapeutic riding program in his hometown. "I wanted to thank you," Marcus said, "not just for the donation that made the program possible, but for showing me that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry pain in a way that helps others." After the call ended, Mortimer stepped outside into the crisp night air. Serenity lifted her head and nickered softly in greeting, a sound that conveyed more warmth and acceptance than all the congratulations he had received during his years of business success. "Thank you," he whispered to the mare who had taught him that the greatest victory wasn't in winning everything, but in learning when to lose gracefully and what was truly worth fighting for. In the distance, he could hear the gentle sounds of horses settling in for the night, not expensive investments returning on capital, but partners in the sacred work of healing broken hearts and restoring hope. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, and for the first time in his life, Mortimer Ashworth felt genuinely rich.